Hi, I'm Tim Gabbett. I'm a high performance consultant for Gabbett Performance Solutions, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Pogo Physio and the Gold Coast Marathon. I'm Brad Beer, physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. The aim of this show is to educate and inspire you towards the pursuit of your own physical best performance. We do this through interviews featuring some of the world's top physical performers and also some of the world's preeminent experts in their chosen fields. Each week, we'll bring you expert editions, interest editions, featured performer episodes, and also coaches' corner editions. And today's episode is an expert edition, and it is featuring Dr. Tim Gabbett. By way of bio, Dr. Tim Gabbett has 20 years experience working as an applied sports scientist with athletes and coaches from a wide range of sports. He holds a PhD in Human Physiology and has completed a second PhD in Applied Science of Professional Football. Tim has worked with elite international athletes over several Commonwealth Games cycles, 2002 and 2006, and Olympic Games cycles, 2000, 2004, and 2008. Tim continues to work as a sports scientist and coaching consultant for several high-performance teams around the world. Some of these teams being the biggest sporting franchises on the planet, including the Chicago Bulls, Liverpool Football Club, Chelsea and Arsenal football clubs, Manchester United, Australian Rugby Union, San Francisco Giants, British Athletics, USA Olympic Committee, and the list goes on and on. You're going to have to jump over to Dr. Tim Gabbett's website to see the remarkable work he has done. It is endless. In addition to Tim's consultancy work around the world, Tim has also published over 200 peer-reviewed articles and has presented at over 200 national and international conferences. Tim is committed to performing world-leading research that can be applied in the real world to benefit high-performance coaches and athletes. And it's through Tim's research that as a physiotherapist in my day-to-day profession, I first became of Dr. Tim Gabbett's work. He's perhaps best known for all things load management in sports medicine, with a seminal paper being published in 2006 titled "The Training Injury Prevention Paradox: Should Athletes Be Training Smarter and Harder?" The paper was a real game changer within sports medicine, as it asserted that the training injury prevention paradox was based on the phenomena where athletes accustomed to high training loads were found to have fewer injuries than athletes training at lower workloads. And yet the paradox is that one would think that greater training loads would produce a greater frequency of injuries. The paper concludes that for athletes to develop the physical capacities required to provide a protective effect against injury, they must be prepared to train hard. On today's episode, Dr. Gabbett shares why training harder might actually be training smarter. We explore some of the factors that determine what training load you can handle at any given point in time. Tim shares a great analogy with our capacity building as athletes that involves the floor, the ceiling, and the basement. Tim shares around some of the problems with spiking training loads or trying to get there too quick, too soon. We talk about the pursuit of the unbreakable athlete. Is it achievable, or is that a utopia? And Tim shares around why the harder you work, the easier it gets. This is an episode I've been very excited to bring you. It is super practical, and you'll take so much from this world-leading authority on all things pursuing our physical best through load management with Dr. Tim Gabbett. Here is my conversation with Dr. Tim Gabbett. Tim Gabbett, this is a real thrill for me. I've been a physiotherapist for 12 years, and I feel like for the bulk of that, your name has been popping up in references on literature, scientific papers, and in the field in general. So to have time with you today is a real thrill. So thanks for coming on the Physical Performance Show.
My pleasure, Brad. Thanks for having me on.
To give a little bit of context to your world, Tim, you do many things, and you do them all very well. But what does a typical week or month look like for Tim Gabbett?
Well, there's some consistency in it. So the consistency comes with the stuff that I do for myself. So, I try and do something for myself before I do something for others. And that's a little bit of a change in mindset. But what that allows me to do, if I've got that consistency, I can take that consistency into other areas of my life where there may be a little bit more chaos. And so a typical week can involve working with different sports, different athletes, or it could be traveling around the world. So that's quite a chaotic kind of part of my life, but by doing the things that have a consistency to it, that allows me to sort of deal with that chaos a lot better, I think.
And you just returned from the US, where I know you ran some workshops, Train Smarter Harder workshops for health professionals over there. So obviously you throw your teaching in there as well.
Yeah, it's that was never meant to be sort of it's kind of something that I did for a little bit of fun on the side of the actual work I was doing with teams and high performance organisations. But what I realised was there's a lot more people out there that are interested in this loading area and getting their athletes out of rehab or getting their athletes to peak performance. And not all of them work at the pointy end of sport, and not all of them work at the top level of high performance organisations, but they all have the same goals. And I use the word athletes. I very rarely will use the word patients because it implies a sickness, but we're all working with athletes along varying points of the athletic spectrum, from being in rehab right through to the peaks of athletic performance. Or it could be an 80-year-old who needs to carry their groceries up the stairs. They're all athletic activities that we want that person to be able to do. We want them to be able to do things that they previously couldn't do, or they previously thought they couldn't do. So what I'm starting to realise is that this work is it's relevant to high level athletes, but it's also relevant to athletes right across the athletic and performance spectrum.
And with the high level athletes, Tim, your work's included working with British athletics, the who's who of the English Premier League football scene, you name it. The teams are there: Australian Rugby League, Australian Rules Football, Chicago Bulls. So when Tim Gabbett gets a call up from these international brands in and of themselves in terms of team sports, and also individual athletes working in national teams, etc., what are they trying to achieve by engaging yourself?
It varies from group to group, Brad. Some organisations have had issues with injuries, and they're trying to work out why that would be the case. Some organisations have very much a performance focus, and they want to, they know that they're ticking most of the boxes, but they want to see if there's something that's obvious that's missing. Sometimes it's about trying to find the right people for that organisation and making sure that the people fit within the culture of the organisation and the philosophy of the organisation. So it varies from group to group, but in general it's anything that revolves around high performance. So if you're thinking high performance, if you want to develop a high performance culture, or you want to improve your training to gear it towards more high performance, and as a result you also want to make sure that you've got as many of your best athletes or operators or performers available for as many activities as possible, then that's the kind of stuff that organisations will contact us for.
Tim, of all the work you've done and all these organisations, athletes, so extensive, is there one transformation story where you've gone in and imparted your skill and knowledge and you've seen a great turnaround that you could briefly illustrate to give us a perspective around what you can achieve, what a team can achieve?
Look, I think there's one particular team, and I won't mention the name of the team, but I will mention that the coach was getting a lot of heat when he took over, and he there was a spike in injury rates when he took over, and this isn't particularly uncommon in sport because they like to impose their training philosophy on the team. And he copped a lot of heat from the media, the armchair experts, but the thing that and part of his training philosophy was that the team needed to train harder in order to be fitter. But from where they were to where he needed to get them to, he had two options. He could take them there slowly and minimise injury risk and eventually get them there, but probably lose 20 games along the way and be out the back door. But he decided that if he was going out on his terms. And he worked them pretty hard and pretty quickly, and there was a lot of injuries. But what happened was, as a result, that team actually adapted to the training stress. They did adapt eventually, and they're playing some of the best tactically and also high energy football that you would see from any team anywhere in the world at the moment. And I'm really happy for that coach because there was a lot of pressure on him early on because of the way they were training. It was external pressure. I really like the fact that he just stuck to his guns and said, I know what I need to do here. I know there could be some short-term pain, but long-term we're going to get some benefit from it. And what you see there is there's a shift in the load injury relationship. The curve shifts to the right. So basically what that means is that at the same load there's a lower risk, or it's the same risk at higher loads. So it's a classic example of what we want our players to be able to do with training. We want them to be able to handle more load and be more robust as a result of it. That's a pretty good example of how the research actually is reflected in practice, but it's also a pretty good practical example of when you do train harder, you do adapt to it.
And it's how you get there that matters, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's always that part to it. Of course, it's always a matter of how much risk you're prepared to accept. At the very elite level, as I sort of highlighted, you could be a coach and you could take them from wherever they are, the floor to the ceiling, and you could take forever, or you take your time getting there, and you may get there safely, but if you lose in a 9-week period, if you lose 18 games along the way, the way sport is these days, you probably won't have a job. So, this is what I'm saying. If a lot of coaches, if they're going to go out, they're going to go out on their terms. So they will typically, the idea is you want to get to that point, that ceiling, as quick as you can, but as safely as you can. And you're always kind of balancing the risk and reward that comes with that. That's the elite level. At lower levels, I just don't think the stakes are as high. So I think we can afford to be a little bit more sensible about it, where we take our time to build to higher loads, and they're the 2 points. It's not just getting there slowly. You actually have to build to something. If you look at 10% of nothing, it's still nothing. So you still need to try and build to higher loads, because higher chronic loads look to be associated with lower injury risk, and they're associated with better performance.
And you mentioned there, Tim, that the aim is to try and increase the loading on the athlete, the individual, to make them more robust, more resilient. So in the terms of a lot of listeners of the Physical Performance Show, they're individual athletes running road races, triathlons, ultras, trail runs, different events of often an individual pursuit. So how does that apply to an individual athlete? Tim, they're trying to become more robust and resilient through appropriate training over time?
Yeah, I mean, the principles of training are going to be the same whether you take a team sport athlete, whether you take someone from the military and special ops, whether you take someone from the circus, or whether you take a marathon runner. If I take someone and ask them to do more than what they're prepared for, then the results are going to be pretty consistent. You're going to increase injury risk. Now, that doesn't mean you're definitely going to break down, but you are going to increase risk. But we also know that when you get to those higher workloads, then it creates a robustness. You have to impose stress on the body in order to handle stress, in order to handle the load that comes with training. You have to load your body. So, if you're a marathon runner and you want to be able to run a fast marathon, then you have to build up to the kind of speeds that you're going to run in a marathon. You may not ever run a marathon in one single training session, but you're putting a program in place to allow you to cope with the acute load spike that comes with a marathon. So it might be a 42-kilometre race, but you need to put enough load in place, enough chronic load in place over a period of time to allow you to cope with that acute load spike of 42 kilometres. And that's what I'm talking about with developing robustness and resilience that comes with training.
And I really love the hashtag that, a lot of people are using there on social media to reference what you do, and that's this hashtag train smarter and harder. So, obviously there's been this awareness of the impact of loading on potential injury risk, both in athletic individuals and also teams. But then I think as you've outlined in one of your most recent papers about debunking some of the myths around loading, you really speak to the fact that just trying to stay in a safe zone at times is not necessarily the answer, that, you've got to train hard and you've got to sometimes surpass certain levels of loading to build that resilience. So training harder is not something to be avoided. It's not an antidote to injuries to not do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Brad. Like, we hear a lot that I'm not training harder, I'm training smarter. We hear it a lot, and typically it's from people who are at the back end of their career, and they've somewhere along the line, this has been what they've been told. And the second point is that from the original training injury prevention paradox paper, I think a lot of people took the acute chronic ratio and said, okay, well, training smarter involves the acute chronic ratio. And the thing that I really want to emphasize about from that paper and from the subsequent debunking of myths paper is that the actual training harder part seems to be kind of missed in it all. The acute chronic ratio tends to fly around, but the actual part of training harder seems to be missed. And that the point that's really worth taking away is training harder might actually be training smarter, because if we wrap our players in cotton wool, we wrap our runners in cotton wool, and manage them away from training load, and then think they're going to be able to handle the demands of a marathon, or think they're going to be able to handle the demands of an 82 or a 162 game season, then of course we're going to be mistaken. So, and the other point, the really important point to take away is that higher chronic loads are associated with lower injury risk. And this is the point that goes against pretty much all of our thinking. When we pick up any textbook on, sports medicine textbook, it says that overuse injuries occur due to training too hard. They overuse injuries occur to overtraining. No one ever stops and questions that and goes, well, actually overuse injuries can occur due to under preparation, due to under training. And that's the big thing that we've noticed is that training harder is actually associated with lower injury risk. So that is a form of training smarter. If you can train harder, then it is a form of training smarter. But you can't just go from 0 to 100% and think that's going to be a smart way to go. And that's where the acute-chronic ratio comes in handy, because it allows you to safely progress and regress loads. So the two go together, and that's what allows you to train smart and train hard.
Yeah, I love it. Training harder, maybe training smarter. And I've heard you say before, Tim, that training is a good thing for you. Who would have thought?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's again, it keeps coming back to that. You pick up most textbooks, and even to today, there's probably a lot of textbooks that would say that overtraining causes a lot of our overuse injuries. But I think the wheel is starting to turn a little bit, and people are starting to realise that there is a point where everyone has a finite capacity, but there is also a point where these overuse injuries don't occur due to doing too much. It's more about doing too much when you're not prepared for it, which then becomes more of an under preparation injury.
Doing too much when you're not prepared for it, yeah. Tim, you mentioned this acute on chronic workload ratio, and for the health professionals listening in, it's probably not a new phrase, but for the weekend warrior, it might sound like a whole lot of mumbo jumbo. Tim, load and load-in, I've just observed as a health professional that it's probably a word that the public is starting to use, the athletic public now. It seems to be all pervasive, yet I like one of your recent papers which referenced that, from the year 2000 to 2018, there has been an enormous growth in the literature or the scientific papers that reference injuries and load-in work rates, etc. So you've been a big part of that. Can you just strip back some of these definitions? What is load-in? How do we measure it? And what on earth is this acute on chronic workload ratio? Briefly.
Yeah. Okay. So load is essentially the external work that we do. So it could be the distance that you run. It could be the weight that you lift. It could be the number of times you throw a ball. That's external load. We then have internal load, which is your response to that external work. So it could be the physiological response. For example, your heart rate. It could be your psychophysiological response, so your perception of effort. It could be your biomechanical response, for example, your joint load. And it takes into account a whole heap of external factors like stress and sleep and mood and soreness and nutrition, hydration. In terms of how we measure it, it'll depend on your sport. So if you have all the technology in the world, then you can probably measure external load using GPS if you're a running-based sport, or you can have different power meters if you're a cycling-based sport. But even if you don't have a large, all those resources at your disposal, and you can measure it with a pen and paper, and all you need to know is you can measure internal load with the perception of effort, and you can measure some of these external factors with a well-being scale. And the final question is, how do we work out whether we're ready to load? How do we know when we've loaded too much? How do we know when we haven't loaded enough? Well, part of the way we can get at this is through measuring acute and chronic loads. The acute load is the load that you've done over a short period of time, and the chronic load is the load that you've done over a longer period of time. Acute load is analogous to fatigue. Chronic load is analogous to fitness. We just take the ratio of the two, put the acute load over the chronic load, and it gives us a ratio. So if our ratio is above 1, it indicates that we're building capacity, we're building chronic load. If our chronic load is or if our ratio is less than 1, it indicates that we're probably in a under trained state where our chronic load is still needs to build. Either way we look at it, we can work out whether we're building, progressing loads, or we're regressing loads. And this is one of the basic principles of training, where we want to know whether we're progressing our athlete in an appropriate fashion. if we put our acute loads up too quickly relative to our chronic load, then it can induce a lot of fatigue, and potentially, if our fitness is low, then we go into our race on Saturday and we're not ready to perform. So it's a really simple way of monitoring progression in your athletes, and giving you a pretty good indication of whether your athlete's in a relative state of fitness or a relative state of fatigue.
Simply said. Thank you, Tim. And I think from an individual pursuit, often with weekend warriors, recreational competitive runners as an example, the external load measurements are very easy. They've never been easier with measurables, GPS data, Garmin's, etc. Yet it's that internal load that so easily gets forgotten, which, as you said, has all those external moderating factors. Have you had much sleep? How's your diet? Are you stressed? And so oils ain't oils when it comes to mileage alone. And I think that's something that people are slowly becoming aware of, but largely through people like yourself, educating professionals that then disseminate it down. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's right. I think slowly but surely people are realising that that a 4 mile run is not the same for people with two very different capacities. Although we still see coaches who will look at this 4 miles or they'll look at someone who's played the exact same minutes, and one player has 4 miles, one's covered 3 miles, and then they'll have the conversations that one's not working harder than the other, but on its own, I don't think that really tells you the full story. You need to take into account external load. You need to take into account the internal response to that load, and you also need to take into account at any point in time your ability to handle load, or your load capacity is influenced by a number of contextual factors. So the way that you can load today and the load that you can tolerate today could be completely different from the load that you can tolerate tomorrow. You haven't lost strength, you haven't lost fitness, but due to contextual factors or due to changes in health, your capacity may have changed. And that's something that slowly but surely people are starting to work out, that there's a number of important pieces of this performance puzzle, and it's not just about load. There's other pieces that fit together that add to ultimately improving performance.
And if you've got the aspiring debut marathoner, Tim, trying to progressively build chronic load and, build up appropriately and at times maybe spike it for a period, but how would they best measure that internal effort, if you like, that internal load that you just referred to before? What's the simplest way that a recreational runner can get data on that?
Yeah, if you don't have any resources at your disposal, then I would suggest using the session RPE. So essentially what that entails is you capture the intensity of your session on a 1 to 10 scale. You multiply that intensity by the duration of your session, and then you've got load for that particular session. So you can look at your load on a session-by-session basis, a day-by-day basis, and then a week-by-week basis. So when you're in a loading phase, when you're building chronic load, then you can actually see whether you're achieving what you're setting out to achieve. When you're in an unloading week and you want to back off the load a little bit, then you can actually see whether you actually have reduced the load. So it's a really simple, but it's a really practical way of quantifying load, and it's probably the most used method to track load across any sport or any activity that wants to get an indication of load anywhere in the world. It's a very, very common method of quantifying load.
And to give a bit more in terms of numerics to that session RPE, Tim, 0 is obviously not moving, you're at rest. 10's maximal exertion you've ever done, really, and 5's in the middle, it's a hard session. So a runner, for example, would simply multiply their perceived effort by their minutes run, say a 60-minute run, and they'd have 300 units of load, correct?
That's right. If they did a hard session, which is a 5, multiply that by 60, that's 300 units of load. And so you can cycle within your week your recovery sessions. Is the recovery session actually a recovery session, or is it harder than I expected it to be? And equally, if you're looking for a highly intense session where you're looking for 8 or 9 and it's only a 5, then you probably need to pick up the intensity. So you can manipulate your training load throughout the week through changes in frequency, changes in volume, or changes in intensity. Any increases or decreases in those 3 variables will bring about a change in training load for that week.
No, that's great. And as a physiotherapist, we've just done up some Excel spreadsheets where people can plug in their load units and track them over time, preparing for a marathon, etc. But is there any resources you'd recommend, Tim, or easy ways for people to do this? A diary. I know you're a big proponent of keeping training diaries, but would you recommend a visual sort of output of it so they can track it over time? Or
look, it depends on the person and how they like to track things. Like some people would probably, they're not necessarily graphic people, or they don't like heaps of colours and they don't like mucking around with spreadsheets. They might just like to keep a little journal, and that's okay as well. I know I work with coaches who prefer that than a lot of the athlete monitoring systems. But then you could go from that level, which is just a pen and paper looking at tracking the training, to Excel. Excel can do a lot of the stuff we need it to do for this type of monitoring, and then there's a lot of different athlete monitoring systems. Too many to mention here, but there's a lot of athlete monitoring systems that you could Google and you'd get 20 or 30 different hits, ranging from very inexpensive to very expensive, depending on your needs. So there's a lot of resources out there.
You're listening to Dr. Tim Gabbett, high performance consultant, on all things optimizing your athletic potential through load management. Support for today's show comes from the Gold Coast Marathon. Just like the Physical Performance Show, the Gold Coast Marathon encourages runners of all ages and abilities to push their boundaries and strive to complete a personal challenge. The Gold Coast Marathon is held annually on the first week in July and is a must-do event for any budding athlete, weekend warrior, or family looking for a challenge to complete together. Run for the good times at the Gold Coast Marathon. Visit goldcoastmarathon.com.au. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. We do this through traditional session-to-session appointments, but also some award-winning, unique, fixed-fee services, including our very popular monthly wellness booster packs, which from a low $197 per month provides physiotherapy access, exercise physiology services, active rehabilitation including clinical Pilates, and also use of state-of-the-art equipment including Normatec recovery boots, Alter-G anti-gravity treadmill, and the Nord board. For more information about Pogo Physio's services, jump over to pogophysio.com.au, peruse the services, and if you're in need of getting back to your physical best following injury, schedule your 1-hour initial appointment. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Tim Gabbett, high performance consultant on all things optimizing our athletic potential. Tim, you mentioned at the start these two words that I've really come to appreciate since I've professionally absorbed your work through your papers, but the ceiling of safety and the floor and the ceiling. And then I have heard you reference the basement. So can you put a little bit of detail around what these terms mean in terms of trying to load up an athlete or prepare a runner for a marathon, for example?
Yeah, look, in terms of preparing anyone for on that athletic spectrum, the three things that I think you really need to know is what is the floor, what is the ceiling, and how much time do you have to get from the floor to the ceiling. So the floor, in my mind, is your current capacity. The ceiling is the required capacity, and the majority of times, if we've got enough time, we can get from the floor to the ceiling and we can get the athlete there in one piece. But in sport at least, we just, on a large occasions, we just don't have enough time. That's typically our biggest enemy in sport or in the military. Is when you get deployed, you have to be ready at all times. So you go from the floor to the ceiling, and time can be very short to get there. So the idea is we want to try and bridge the gap as much as possible between the floor and the ceiling, so that gap isn't as great, so we don't have to take as long to get from point A to point B. The other problem that we have, obviously, is that quite commonly in sport, when we have someone in rehab for a long period of time, or they've been in a good paddock in the off-season, they've let themselves go in the off-season, and they come back on day one of pre-season, and rather than having an adequate floor to handle the loads of day one of pre-season, they come back in a very deconditioned state, and rather than being at the floor, they're in the basement. And essentially what we're saying there is we basically have to take them from point A to point B, but we have to take them there in the same amount of time. So we have to get them from point A to point B, and we have to ramp them up really quickly. And with that comes an increased risk. So the way that we can deal with that is just trying to maintain an adequate floor, so that gap between the floor and the ceiling isn't as great. We're just trying to bridge the gap a little bit so that we can still get to the ceiling, but we can get there in one piece.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such a simple and beautifully depicted sort of illustration, because I think anyone can grasp that. You've got the floor, which is your baseline, I guess, level of robustness, but then you've got that required capacity, which is your ceiling. If that's the marathon you want to run in 6 months' time, and you want to bridge that gap. And the floor, Tim, when you cited that there, it made me think of runners, and sometimes this is at the pointy end of performance, sometimes professional triathletes, or, to a lesser degree, I guess, some of the track and field runners and the road runners. But, they might have 11 months of rigorous endurance activity, and then they're on their break, and it's a 1 month break. And I think some of the habits have changed, but there was a day when that 1 month break might mean that they barely ran for a month, and yet their normal mileage is, maybe 80 to 100k a week. So that's an example, correct, of that floor being, removed or lessened down to more of a basement level, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Like at some point in time, I think that's the advice we get. We still hear a little bit is, you just need to get away from the sport. So if we use baseball as an example, in some levels of baseball, the advice is put your arm on ice, shut your throwing down for 3 months. You got to rest your arm because you've only got so many bullets. Now, what that does is it creates a pressure when you come back to spring training, and you're expected to throw pretty regularly and throw pretty hard. But if you've had 3 months break, then your body's just not ready for that. And it's the same with running. If you normally run 100 kilometres in a week and then don't run for 4 weeks, then there's going to be a period of time where you have to build your chronic load again. And it's going to take you if you don't run at all over that 4 week period, it can take you quite a fair amount of time to get back up to that higher chronic load. So you can't just pick up where you left off. The majority of people can't do that. It would take a very special athlete who has a number of other factors in place that would allow them to do that. But the problem is with the detraining that occurs over that 4 week period, a lot of those factors that would normally be protective they actually get diminished as well. So the safest thing that I could recommend is yes, get away from your sport. Try and mentally refresh from whatever sport that you're doing, but try and keep your chronic load just ticking over. You don't have to train at 100%. You don't have to train at the ceiling the entire time, but you want to try and stop yourself from going from the ceiling to the floor and then down into the basement. It's much harder to safely progress loads from the basement. It's very easy to spike loads from the basement. So if you maintain a minimum chronic load, which would be a minimum floor, that means that you don't have to be at the ceiling, but it just makes it easier to get to the ceiling when you need to do that.
Yeah, and I guess outside of the regulated professional sporting team environment, a challenge that recreational weekend warriors, runners have, for example, is patience. Busy lives, to come back from the basement because they've gone to the paddock to graze over Christmas, or they've just taken a mental break, which has included not putting the shoes on, is sometimes not very palatable. Hence, we're all guilty, I think, at times of jumping in and trying to get from the floor to the ceiling too quickly, which, as you've referenced already, it increases the risk, not necessarily the rate, but it increases the risk of getting injured. Yeah,
and we're all a little bit that way. We're all sort of, maybe it's the way we're all wired, is we're all in a bit of a hurry to get to where we're going. So, coaches want to start playing the style they want to play as quickly as they can. So they want to get as much load into their athletes as possible. Strength and conditioning coaches generally want to get players as fit as possible, as fast as possible, and most of the time, even if you're in rehab, you want to get out of rehab as quickly as possible. But the main question you just want to keep putting in the back of your mind is, am I prepared for what I'm about to do, or what I'm about to ask myself to do? And if you're going from regularly running 1 kilometre a day, and then you decide, well, I'm going to run a marathon this weekend, then you just got to ask yourself, based on the loading that I've been doing over a regular period of time, am I actually prepared for this marathon? And you ask the majority of people, and they would probably say, no, I don't think you've done enough work for that marathon. You're loading well, you're loading consistently, but you're closer to the floor than the ceiling. So you need to put a bit more work in before you can actually run this marathon. So it's all we're trying to do is, everyone I speak to wants to load, and they see the benefits of load. But all we're trying to do is, yes, high chronic loads are a good thing. You want to get to the ceiling, but try and get there in a sensible way.
# train smarter and harder.
Exactly.
Tim, as you just outlined that, it made me think that really the work in rehabilitation is purely from taking people from oftentimes the basement, hopefully safely, to the ceiling. That really is the essence of rehabilitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we tend to think of rehab as being at the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to performance. But the way you rehabilitate an athlete will determine, it will have some influence over how that person performs at the top level, or at the high ends of performance at the ceiling. If we set a good foundation in place, if we load correctly, and if we have a pretty good eye on what we're actually getting that athlete back for, then I actually don't see them as being at two opposite ends of the spectrum. We're not focusing on injury prevention. What we're focusing on is performance. Everyone is in the performance game. Whether you're in early stage rehab, or whether you're training for the most demanding passage of play, or the ceiling of a marathon, we should all be focusing on performance. So that early stage rehab, you might have one eye on biological healing. You might have one eye on making sure that you heal that injured tissue, but you also should have one eye on, well, what am I getting this athlete back for? what do I actually need to be able to do? If you can set appropriate foundations there, then it sets them up to stay injury free and also perform well at the top level.
And I guess if you're coming out of that basement, you've been in a boot, you're aspiring to get back to whatever their best is, whatever your physical best is, that it's important to note that, you're going to need smaller increases in load because your floor fell out, so to speak. So, you just got to take your time and be guided by hopefully a professional that has that in mind.
Yeah, look, I think, when we're talking about changes in load from week to week, for example, not all load's created equally. So, we could use the 10% rule or the 10% guide, whatever you prefer to call it. And I think on average, that's a pretty good guide. 10% changes in load from week to week. Try not to exceed that, but it's all going to be relative to your chronic load. So if you've been in bed rest for a year, then 10% increases in load from week to week might be too much. If you're at the ceiling, then there's no way in the world that you're going to be able to add 10% on top of a really high chronic load from week to week. So it's probably going to be more like 0.1%. And then in the middle is probably where you're going to be able to handle larger increases in load, at least for short periods of time. The reality is that the evidence around the 10% rule isn't great. There's not a lot of published research. So when we talk about evidence-based practice, the 10% rule wouldn't be evidence-based practice, but potentially it's practice-based evidence, because I know that it's been used for a lot of years, particularly by endurance sport athletes. Runners particularly use the 10% rule. So there might be something in it. It's just that there's not a lot of published research around the 10% rule. But I know that it's used by runners and endurance sport athletes worldwide. So there could be something in it.
And I mean, it just brings up the variability between athletes, between their background, their chronic load, their fitness, if you like. It's always got to be individualised. And I've heard you say this, Tim, in your teachings, in your work, that yes, we might talk about data, but we're always working with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the numbers are great. It allows us to get a snapshot of where someone is at any point in time. But numbers are just that. They're numbers. We still have to go back and we have to work with the athlete. We have to coach the athlete, and any particular score, whether it's 4 miles or an RPE of 5 or whatever the value is that we're measuring, we still have to take it in context with the individual. And I'm a really big believer that we have to coach the athlete, not the number. So the numbers are helpful to kind of support our decision making, but they don't actually drive the decision making. We work with athletes to actually get the athlete better, not to be dictated to by numbers.
You're listening to Dr. Tim Gabbett, high-performance consultant, sharing around load management and the pursuit of maximising our athletic potential. If you missed last week's episode, it was an interest edition featuring none other than much-loved Australian celebrity Commando Steve. That's right, of Biggest Loser fame and also more recently Australian Survivor fame. Here's a little snippet of what you missed.
I'm as human as the next person. That's one thing that I've recognised, is I'm really no different. And I've always known that. We all experience pain, suffering and fear, but a lot of us try to, or we make out in our own minds that our pain, our suffering and fear is greater or more significant than the next person's.
To tune into the full episode and explore the archives of the show, be sure to jump over to your favourite podcast player and enjoy any of the guests that tickle your fancy, including episode 1 featuring Australian Ironman surf lifesaving champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Tim Gabbett, high performance consultant on all things load management and optimising our athletic potential. Tim, one of your most recent publications was In the Pursuit of the Unbreakable Athlete and the role of moderating factors and circular causation. But the question is, can an unbreakable athlete be developed?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I tend to look at things as glass half full rather than glass half empty. So I'm going to keep focusing on. I think we're going to be able to do it. Now, if you ask some of my co-authors on that paper, it took us forever to get that paper published because we were going back and forth with each other, arguing with each other about whether it could be done. And that's part of what makes it a better paper is the differences of opinion. So there would be some people, on that paper, and even, some people who just read the paper, they would clearly just comment, no, it can't be done. So, I tend to be a little bit more positive in my thinking, and I think, well, whether it can or can't be, I can't answer the question, but I'll keep working towards it. I want to keep trying to push my athletes towards that end, that we're trying to make you robust and resilient more than worrying about things that may never happen. So that's kind of my approach, that there's a lot more positives that come with training than negatives, but it won't be a matter of just, well, we control load and then we develop robustness. There's going to be, at any point in time, your ability to handle load depends on your load capacity, and at any point in time, your load capacity will be dependent on your health and also contextual environmental factors, so that it's not just going to be a matter of load more and your performance improves. There's a whole heap of pieces of that jigsaw that allows us to sort of pull it together. But yeah, look, I'd like to think it's possible. The reality is everyone will have an opinion on it. Some of those opinions will be just that. They will be opinions, and then there will be others that will have evidence-based opinions. They will be forming those opinions based on some evidence. But whether you think it's possible or not doesn't really matter. The fact that if we were all agreeing on it, then there's probably not room for all of us to be there, or no need for all of us to be there. So those disagreements are good. It's what actually makes it probably a stronger question, a more interesting question to see whether it can be done.
And, your reference is an example that everyone can appreciate. Kobe Bryant, basketball US superstar, that he had such great physical capacity, capabilities in his early career, and then by the end of his career, it was quite injury-plagued, where he averaged 34% fewer games in his final 5 seasons than his first 15. So what could you share around Kobe Bryant as an example to really drive home some of your teachings around this concept of trying to make an athlete robust?
Yeah, well, look, my knowledge of Kobe Bryant is probably the same as anyone else's knowledge. What I've read, what I've heard. But I was pretty lucky. Just over the weekend, I met with Judy Cito, who was his physical therapist during those times, during those LA Lakers years, and we had a great chat about her thoughts, her insights, her perspectives. Looking back, would they have done things differently? What could have contributed in the final 5 years to those injuries compared to the first 15 years? And she didn't actually mention Kobe specifically, but she did mention that there was a bit of a change in the mindset of NBA players in general, that this whole resting mindset, that they were worried about minutes, and there was more of a focus towards rest, and we need to save your legs for the game rather than the training that would have been done previously, and that the lifting that was previously a thing that was done regularly started to get phased out. Some of the conditioning work that was done regularly started to get phased out. So it was interesting to hear her perspective in that the preparation for those top end demands of the game, the ceiling, tended to change around that period. Now again, she didn't say Kobe changed his preparation at all at that time, but she just noticed, and she was involved with the Lakers for a lot of years, and saw the changes in the way they prepared over a period of time. So that to me was really interesting, that the way the way athletes, or in particular NBA players, prepared for the demands of the game changed over a period of time. Early on, they prepared really well, and there was a lifting culture, there was a physical preparation culture, and then it moved from a training and physical prep culture to more of a recovery culture so it almost got to a point that they were recovering from recovery sessions. So it was an interesting conversation.
Which, I mean, it really just brings to the fore that we can't just sort of from the sidelines, the armchair, say, well, it's age that's done it. It can also be those other factors, as you outline. And I've heard you say, if you prepare soft, you play soft. So comes back to this theme, doesn't it? Hashtag train smarter. Yeah, include your recovery devices, etc., and your recovery best practices, but make sure you're training hard as well. So
I've been fortunate enough to work with some really good athletes, and the ones who've sustained performance for a long period of time. There might have been some that got to the top, but they didn't stay there very long unless they continued to work hard. The ones who had that sustained excellence and had sustained performance over a long period of time, there was no easy way for them to get there. They had to train hard and they had to do it consistently. And yes, they recovered in between those hard sessions, and they built in recovery into their programs. But there was no easy way to get it. There was no shortcut. A lot of it just involved working really hard, day in, day out, a number of years to develop the chronic load in order to be at their best when it really mattered. So it's a funny kind of situation. Like if you spoke to people of 30 years ago, they would say, well, of course that's the case. That's exactly what we've already known. So it could be a matter of what's old is new again. But essentially, if you talk about anyone who's achieved success in any area of their life, they've had to work pretty hard to get there. So it's no surprise that our best athletes are the ones who typically work the hardest. And the one that stands out in my mind at the moment is probably LeBron James. He's obviously a very gifted, talented athlete, but he works really hard to maintain health and to maintain his performance at a very high level.
Yeah, so interesting. And I know rugby league's close to your heart, near and dear, with your work you've done over the years, and hailing from Brisbane, Australia. But I think of the rugby league players. They used to work full-time jobs as well as play games, and there wasn't a lot of downtime, seemingly. I don't know what the injury rates were like then compared to now. There's so many factors, but it's just an interesting thought, right?
Yeah, they were a different breed then. They'd work all day and then they'd go and train pretty hard at night. And yeah, they played tough too. It was a different era, and probably the closest thing we've got to that is the Queensland Cup, which is the tier below the NRL. And for me, I feel they work a lot harder than a lot of NRL players, because a lot of those guys are on roofs all day out in 40 degrees Celsius heat. It's humid, or they're digging holes, and then they finish work and then they go lift, they're doing some high intensity running, and then they're doing skills, and then they're back doing it again at 6 o'clock the next morning. So I think a lot of those guys are working pretty hard at that level.
Tim, just very briefly, a lot of health professionals, and I think it's slowly disseminated into recreational athletes, but can be afraid of these spikes in load. And I know we've already briefly touched on this, but just to summarise the link that, I guess, to give some detail around the fact that spikes in load are definitely not to be avoided at all costs. So can you briefly speak to that?
Yeah, well, look, we know that on average, when you increase loads really quickly, then you increase the risk. But just because we increase the risk doesn't mean that you're definitely going to break. So some spikes in load are unavoidable. They come with the nature of a race. They come with the nature of a game. Sometimes, for example, in a team sport, you think you're preparing for a 100-metre race, but halfway in the game, the rules change and becomes an 800-metre, because no two team sport games are the same. you just don't know what the game's going to throw at you. So that could result in a spike in load. You do your best to prepare for that by building chronic load, but sometimes spikes in load come and sometimes they're unavoidable. And that doesn't mean you panic on the back of that. You just manage the response of your players on the back of that. Sometimes you intentionally plan spikes in your training program because you know that those shock blocks can result in functional overreaching, and it can actually result in better performance. But you do it as part of a plan. You try and build chronic load so that your players are able to cope with any shock block. So yes, spikes in load increase risk, but sometimes it's done as a plan, sometimes they're unavoidable, and sometimes certain players will handle spikes in load better than others. So you always look at the athlete, the individual athlete, and you go, well, if this player has developed a chronic load and he's strong and he's fit, he's probably more likely to handle any spike in load a lot better than someone who has a long injury history, has a poor chronic load, and is unfit and relatively weak. So you're always trying to manage that spike relative to your individual athlete.
And shock blocks there, you use that phrase, and it's something I've just become appreciative of through your work. That my understanding, that's periods that athletes earned through their consistent training that's built up their floor, if you like, got it closer to their ceiling of their capacity, but that's where they might be intentionally heavily loaded and hardly trained, or train hard, I should say, for a period of trying to then make their gains, their physical capacities accelerate with the appropriate rest after. So how might that apply for a more recreational athlete, Tim?
Look, I would say initially you probably don't need a shock block for a recreational athlete. I think probably the thing that you need there is just consistent loading. So if you can get enough consistent training in, you will get heaps of great improvements just if you can train consistently. Shock blocks are probably more designed to someone who has developed a decent chronic load over a long period of time, and you're just trying to squeeze a little bit of extra capacity out of that person who's very close to their ceiling. And the reality is the vast majority of people don't train hard enough to warrant going through a shock block. For a recreational runner, I wouldn't bother with a shock block. Initially you just need to get some consistent training under their belt.
No, great. Tim, finally, if you could boil everything you've learned across your career, this is an impossible question, but I know you're a man of that wouldn't shy from the challenge, to one piece of advice. If you could only distill one piece of advice to help people pursue their physical best across any endeavour, what would it be?
Oh, look, I think this applies to sport or applies to life. I think the harder you work, the easier it gets. So that's kind of my little motto, I guess, and it's things that I learned from a very early age, that if something's worth achieving, you have to work hard for it, and the harder you work at it, the better chance you've got of actually achieving that. So that's the advice I'd give across any domain, whether it be sport, business, or just life in general. The harder you work, the easier it gets.
Tim, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Tim Gabbett's physical challenge for the week going to be?
Okay, well, this is one that's probably someone who's got a decent chronic load and doesn't mind a little bit of circuit and cardio training. So this is one I call the circuit of death. So you've got 7 cycles through this. You start with 7 efforts on any cardio machine you like. It could be a treadmill, rower, elliptical. They're 10-second effort, 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off. You do 7 of those. Then you do 7 exercises, a push, a pull, leg exercises, some abs, whatever you choose. You do 7 reps of each, and you do 7 cycles through. So you've got your cardio plus 7 exercises, 7 reps, 7 times through. And you're doing it for time. So you want to try and keep your form throughout the whole process, and you want to get through it as quick as you can. If you can work off 47 minutes or less, I think you'll get 47 minutes or 49 minutes really easily, but that's kind of one that's a pretty solid session. By the end of the 4th round, you're looking for a shady tree. So and then you just try and hang on for the last 3 cycles through. But it's not a bad one to do as a group as well. If you've got 7 people with you or 8 people, then you can all sort of rotate through the exercises together, and it's a good little team building session as well.
Tim Gabbett, Circuit of Death. That's a first for the show, Tim. And if we want to find out more about your work, your services, obviously got the great website gabbettperformance.com.au. That's GABBETT performance.com.au. And where can we find you on social, Tim?
Yeah, look, we will put stuff out on Twitter. It's at Tim Gabbett. There's Facebook and all the typical social medias. So if you go to any of those places, there'll be information on workshops, all the research. If you ever need any research, feel free to contact me directly, and I'll send you any one of the papers that you need. You can even have more if you like. So any papers that you need, just feel to reach out, and we'll send them straight through.
Tim, thank you. Appreciate your time, and all the best with the year ahead.
Thanks, Brad. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. All the best.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed today's expert edition featuring Dr. Tim Gabbett. So much information that Dr. Tim shared there. It's one of those episodes that you may need to go back and listen to 2 or 3 times to make sure you don't miss any of the key teachings and learnings. If you did enjoy today's episode, then please let Tim know. You'll find Tim over on Instagram at Gabbett Tim, that's GABBETTTIM, or also over on Twitter at Tim Gabbett, TIMGABBETT. And of course, another great way to let Tim and myself know what it is that you took from today's sharings. Don't forget to load up your podsies. That's simply a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying. Tag in Tim in on Instagram and the Physical Performance Show at Physical Performance Show, and let us know what it is that you've enjoyed or learnt. Massive thank you to you, the good folk, who have been doing 2 things. 1, subscribing to the show. That really is the best way to obviously get each and every episode into your earbuds as they go live each and every week, but also for taking the time to leave an iTunes rating or review. And that's really simple. You can do it from your smartphone or, of course, your desktop or laptop computer. And a big shout out this week to show reviewer Coco Joy. Coco Joy rated the show 5 stars and commented, "Always insightful and informative. I'm yet to listen to a podcast that I don't take something away from. Highly recommended." Coco Joy, thank you for taking the time to leave that review. As a little thank you, be sure to get in touch over on social media or via email b.beer@pogophysio.com.au, and we'll get a copy of the revised and expanded 2nd edition of You Can Run Pain Free out in the post to you as a little thank you. Massive thanks to the good folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, all things show administration, and Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Another huge thank you for this week's show supporter, the Gold Coast Marathon. If you are looking for that mid-year challenge, be sure to jump over to goldcoastmarathon.com.au and select your event, or select your event for your entire family, from the junior dash right through to the full feature-length Gold Coast Marathon. There's an event for everyone, and it is one of my favourite events on the calendar every year. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we go live with a featured performer, and that is none other than a rising Australian distance running star, Stuart Mcswain. Stewie Mac, as he is affectionately known, is a Melbourne track club athlete under the tutelage of Nick Beddoe, and his recent performances have been nothing short of remarkable. Hailing from the sparsely populated King Island in Tasmania, Stewie has gone on to break the Australian indoor mile record, running a scintillating 3:35 recently at the Birmingham Indoor Grand Prix. And prior to that, Stewie became the second fastest Australian across the 5,000 metre distance, clocking a remarkable 13:05.23 at the Brussels Diamond League meet in 2018. Stewie boasts PBs of 27.50 for 10,000 metres on the track. He's the Australian dual 10,000 metre champion, and a very speedy 28.03 for 10k on the road. This is an episode you're not going to want to miss. Featured performer Stuart Mcswain next week on the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.